Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining Duke Science and Society for our coronavirus conversation. My name is Maria Carnovale, and I'm a lead policy analyst at Duke Science and Society. In the midst of COVID-19, election officials will have the difficult task of preserving everyone's right to vote while protecting the health of voters and poll workers that risk COVID-19 infection. At Science and Society, we have collected best practices in a policy brief that is going to be published today. And to further explore the issues, we have decided to bring together this terrific group of scholars. Just a few housekeeping notes before I hand it over to our moderator. If you have any questions for our panelists, please send them to Tim Dermott or Ben Shepard in the chat. They will redirect them to the moderator, who will try to get to as many questions as possible. Please make sure to keep your video off and your microphone muted throughout the event. After the event, you can check out our next coronavirus conversation on the upcoming Atlantic hurricane season and how it will impact the resurgent COVID pandemic. While you're on the Duke website, on the Duke Science and Society website, you can also learn about our master's program, where our students and faculty address the issues we have discussed the past few weeks on a daily basis. With that out of the way, let's meet our guest today. Dr. Martha Croft is a professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration and in the Public Policy Program at the UNC Charlotte. Her research focuses on election administration, political participation, and the policy process. She's the author of Helping America Vote: The Limits of Election Reform and Institutions and the Right to Vote in America. Professor Guy Ariel Charles is the Edward and Ellen Schwarzman Professor of Law at the Duke University School of Law. He's the co-director of the Duke Law Center on Law, Race, and Politics. He teaches and writes about constitutional law, election law, campaign finance, redistricting, politics, and race in multiple highly esteemed publications. Dr. Anupam Jena is the Ruth Newhouse Associate Professor of Healthcare Policy at Harvard Medical School and a physician in the Department of Medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital. He's also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Dr. Jena's research involves several areas of health economics and policy, including the economics of physician behavior and the physician workforce, healthcare productivity, medical malpractice, and the economics of medical innovation. Dr. Nita Farhani will be moderating the discussion. He's a Robinson Everett Professor of Law at Duke University, the founding director of the Duke University Initiative for Science and Society, and the chair of our Bioethics and Science Policy Master's Program. From 2010 to 2017, she served on the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues and is a leading scholar on the intersection of law, science, and technology. We are very excited to have them here today, and with that, I will leave the floor to our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's a delight to be able to be joined by my friend and colleague, Guy Charles, with my other colleagues, Dr. Kropp and Dr. Jena. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we have today. The way that we'll do this is we've invited each of the panelists to spend just a few minutes giving us a bit of a context for their own research that helps frame this conversation. And then we'll have a far-ranging conversation about the implications of coronavirus for upcoming elections, thinking about the implications of recent Supreme Court opinions and how that affects and interacts with the different issues that we're going to talk about today. And ultimately, how we can try to safeguard our right to vote while all remaining safe under the current circumstances. So I thought we would start with Dr. Jena, who has recently penned a New York Times piece on really helping us to contextualize what are the risks. Are they any more serious here for voting in person? Should we be moving toward all mail-in voting in light of the pandemic? But really just to start with the facts, because that's what we like to do in all of these science and society conversations, is to have a strong grounding in the facts before we start engaging in the broader implications of those facts for society. So Dr. Jena.
Thank you for having me. So I'll start with a little bit of background. I'm an economist and a physician. I am not an epidemiologist, but I'm sitting on an armchair, so I'm happy to take on that role as well. I was actually just on service at MGH about a month ago, around the time that COVID-19 was peaking in Boston. So I have an appreciation for what these patients look like clinically and the disruption that happens in the hospital. So, I mean, it's a serious issue, obviously. Let me just share a couple of thoughts on maybe on the New York Times piece, and then some subsequent work that we've done to help maybe put a finer point on this issue of what we would expect to happen with elections. So about a month and a half ago, we thought this would be an issue, and obviously at that time there weren't enough experiments for us to look at primary elections or other large gatherings to get a sense of what would be the impact of this kind of one-time large gathering on spread of disease. But what we did think was, well, if we look back at historical national elections, which happened obviously in November, it's a time when flu and other respiratory viruses are circulating in the community. It's not unfathomable to think that we have a lot of people come to isolated locations on one day, standing in line together, potentially touching the same surfaces, that we might see upticks in flu or transmission of other typical upper respiratory infections, viruses that cause those. And long story short, we didn't really see much. Now, we used a very similar methodology of a study that was just released and that I'll describe in a second in the National Bureau of Economic Research. But we looked at the weeks before, we looked at the weeks after the elections. We broke it down by the density of the area where the voting occurred, by sociodemographics, by the prevalence of flu and other upper respiratory infections in those areas to see maybe there's a larger effect in those areas where we think viruses are more likely to be circulating in the weeks before the election. We didn't find any increase. Now, that is not to say that we would expect to see the same thing with coronavirus. I don't think that we would, because the degree of infectivity or the reproduction number that some of you may be familiar with is thought to be higher for coronavirus than for flu, and certainly could be also for the other respiratory viruses that cause the typical cold. Now let's fast forward to what we might expect to happen with elections in November. I think the best experience that we can look at is what's happened around the primaries, the few primaries that have occurred. So I'll give you two data points there. One is a paper that was released as a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper. So it's not peer reviewed yet, it's not published, but the authors obviously spent a lot of time thinking about these issues. And what they found is, when looking at the Wisconsin primary, looking at coronavirus cases in the weeks before and the weeks after the primary, and looking also at areas that had high voter turnout versus lower voter turnout, they show a few things. One is they use cell phone data to show that there is an increase in the concentration of people around voting sites on the day of the primary, which is not a surprise. But they also find that there's an increase in cases that happens about 2 to 3 weeks after the primary in Wisconsin occurred. To put some numbers on it, they find that it's about a 7% increase in the number of cases that happen in let's say, the month and a half afterwards. So it's not a small increase that we're talking about here. The challenge with that is the study design doesn't necessarily preclude the possibility that those increases in cases that we observed were unrelated to the election, to the primary. I think to really say this with a degree of certainty, we need variation across areas where elections are happening at different points in time to get at that. I will say that we had the same idea, and we did look at Michigan and Wisconsin as well, and we didn't find anything, and we didn't write it up as a result. So that's, you can take that with a grain of salt. That is to say that if you just look at the raw data and look at when the elections happened in Michigan and look at when they happened in Wisconsin, and just see observably, visually, whether you see an increase in cases in the time period that you would expect, which would be something like 10 days if you factor in an incubation period and a slight delay for people to actually go to the doctor, and then additional small delay for the cases to actually be reported to the public health departments. We didn't see any increase. Now, that's not to say that those increases weren't there, we could dig deeper, but it's not a foregone conclusion that we would see an increase in cases. That being said, I would be very cautious. I'd be very careful when November comes. I would expect that with that large scale exposure, people, that we would see an increase in cases. I think what we're seeing now is that people are a little bit more sophisticated about hand hygiene, about covering their face. I think that would mitigate some of the effects that the negative effects we might expect if we have a lot of people hanging out at polling stations and potentially touching the same surfaces. And the last thing I'd say is it's November, right? And so that is a time when a lot of other things are circulating around, and coronavirus may also be circulating in a way that it's not circulating. It's obviously circulating now, but the transmission may be different in November than it would be in the middle of summer, or even a couple months ago when spring was starting, when these primaries were being held. In terms of things that you could do, I mean, I think that the answers are the same thing that we've been recommending to people for the time being, which is.
Well, let me pause you there. We're going to get there.
Okay. All right. Perfect.
I want to lay out some of these facts. Are you going to be looking closely at what happens in Texas next week?
Probably, yeah. Yeah.
That'll be probably very difficult to disaggregate as well, but presumably there will be another place where we could get pretty good, at least correlations to see what happens after voting, which will be interesting. So bottom line for you, are you, based on all of this data, are you not worried or not particularly worried about in-person voting based on the facts?
I would say I am worried because I think we don't have enough facts. I mean, we just have two data points that go in different directions, and you can take my data point with a huge grain of salt. But I would say there has to be worry because it's the way that the virus spreads is by person-to-person contact. So it's impossible to think that the virus would spread. How large an effect we would observe, I think that's going to be the question.
Got it. Okay, well, thanks. We'll come back to build on these facts in just a moment, and especially I'd like to hear your suggestions about things that people ought to be doing when they are voting. But I want to turn to Dr. Charles next, who has done a lot of research and scholarship looking at the Voting Rights Act and the implications for voting and procedures that states can now put into place without much check on what those procedures are, and see what he's thinking about the upcoming elections, both in terms of coronavirus, but also more broadly in light of recent Supreme Court rulings, what he's concerned about and what he thinks we might be able to expect for the next election cycle. Dr. Charles.
Thank you, Dr. Farahani. So consistent with the mandate, what I want to do is just begin to establish some background framework so that way we can understand the legal context within which these types of crises happen and how much pressure they put on the legal system. So I'll very quickly run through what I think of as six basic characteristics of the American electoral system, particularly as it relates to November. So the first basic characteristic is that there is no express right to vote for president in the American Constitution, say compared to, say, the South African Constitution that provides that every adult citizen has the right to vote in elections for any legislative body. There's no equivalent, and that will affect how we think about another aspect of the American system, which is the role that litigation plays in resolving election disputes. So the first thing is the absence of an express right to vote, particularly for president in the federal constitution. The second thing to think about is the fact that American electoral systems are very decentralized, and that federalism is a key component of the election framework. So there's a division, not just a division of authority between the states and the federal government, but more importantly, that the states themselves are responsible for running elections, including federal elections, though Congress has some supervisory power. So what that means is that there are going to be different practices in different set of states. And so what may happen here in North Carolina will be different from what happens in South Carolina and Texas and elsewhere. Relatedly, everything is also very decentralized and localized. So you might have differences within one state from county to county. So one county might run things well and might adopt a certain policy, and another county might do something very different. Third, there are too few professionals that run elections. So we depend a lot on volunteers for administering elections. And then think about this in the context of a pandemic, when people are worried about their health, as they ought to be. So it's not just about voting, right? About people showing up at the polls, voters showing up at the polls to vote, but it is also about the volunteers upon which we depend on to run these elections. Fourth, there's the voters bear the burden of participation. So the government doesn't take responsibility for registering voters, for providing information that's borne by the voters, by the parties. And that also will become relevant when we talk about the implications of this pandemic. Fifth, there's the partisan administration of elections and the role that partisanship and ideology plays. So one of the things that we've seen in this pandemic are the partisan fights that are involved in how you run elections, when you hold them, under what sets of circumstances, and the fights divide along partisan and as well as ideological lines. And then lastly, the role of courts. Litigation as the primary mechanism for resolving disputes. That has both a positive and a negative, but in order to really appreciate the challenges posed by the electoral system, its ability to handle these types of stressors, right, such as presented by a global pandemic, you have to understand these basic characteristics and how those basic characteristics impact our ability to respond to these types of events. And so I know we'll talk more about what we can do about them, and we might even talk about how they each might have a specific impact, but first wanted to set some ground framework so that way we're all on the same page as to what the legal background may look like and the circumstance and how it might explain some of the types of responses that we're seeing.
Thank you, Dr. Charles. That's very helpful context. Just to tease out one factual piece of that, you mentioned that we're talking about a lot of the people who are administering the elections are volunteers, and a lot of those volunteers, as I understand it, are people who are probably in the most at-risk populations, right? So it's a lot of folks who are retired or people who are in an older age bracket. Is that consistent with your research and your findings?
That's correct. So many of the volunteers, and it makes sense if you think about opportunity costs, the folks who are able to volunteer and participate, most of them are older individuals and also susceptible to this virus in a particularly vulnerable way.
So it sounds like we're in for significant variation as usual, but significant variation at a time where we're seeing a global pandemic that is hitting states disproportionately at the current time, but certainly equally painfully across the country. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens next.
And that's a really important point, because we're thinking about a national election, though our elections are very decentralized. Even though we're thinking it's a vote for president, but really it's every single state. But a pandemic that may not affect the nation uniformly as well, right? So that's another uncertainty that is added by November, and something to think about that has to be taken into account.
Right, and if anything about the current surges makes clear, it's unpredictable as to where each state will be in November. So I want to turn third to Dr. Kropp, with thanks to Dr. Charles for setting that stage, who's also done some incredibly important research, really looking at the ability of members of disadvantaged classes to participate in elections, and has written extensively about the implications of the different procedures and variations that Dr. Charles was speaking about on different populations, and has put a lot of thought into how we can engage the population more inclusively. So I turn it to Dr. Kropp to make some opening remarks as well.
Thank you very much. So I think that I want to echo all of the things that Professor Charles mentioned, and but also, and Dr. Jenna as well. It's important to realize, though, despite the facts, despite what we know is out there possibly for the coronavirus, the mass public that's out there has a lot fewer facts than our armchair epidemiologist with a medical degree and an economics degree. And in fact, people are trying to make the best decisions they can about whether or not they should be going out to vote or not. I've been trying to keep my eye on public opinion. I've been trying to figure out if people are actually wanting to vote at this point. And if you take a look at some of the public opinion polls, I think it's going to show you what we all instinctively know, what we've all been hearing is that people are responding to those elite cues out there about the coronavirus. With one side, typically the Republican Party or more conservatives, thinking it's not as big a danger, not necessary to wear face masks. And with a more liberal side, more Democratic side saying we need to take these steps and we need to have a coherent national strategy. If you look at, for example, an NPR Public Broadcasting Marist College poll, it looks like a big partisan divide on who's going to be voting by mail in the next election. And just asking a national population if they want to vote by mail, 2/3 of Democrats in that sample said they planned on voting by mail, where about 40% of Republicans planned on voting by mail. Now, that poll doesn't speak about the difficulty or the ease of getting the absentee ballots, but it really does speak about the partisan divide that we're seeing in some of these issues. So it's not just partisanship and say the partisanship of local election officials or the partisanship of the elites at the highest levels of government, but it's also the mass public. I also do work on early voting, and I've looked quite a bit at election administration. One thing that I'm currently doing work on is how much localities are spending on elections more generally. And it seems pretty clear to me when you're looking at it. The average in the country from at least the data that we have right now is that locals, counties are expending about $8 a voter right now. So I want you to contrast that to studies that are out there. With studies that are out there, at least the Brennan Center suggested that it would take something like $4 billion to run a safe election. I think we'll probably spend some time talking about South Korea, because word on the street is in South Korea that there weren't any cases of coronavirus coming out of that election. Obviously, I would hope that Dr. Jenna will take that on, because I am curious to know more about that. It's important to note that if you know this prominent voting rights group is suggesting that we spend $400 billion on or $4 billion on elections, that the amount that was provided in federal funds in terms of the CARES Act money, which was about what, 400 million, it's going to be inadequate for what we need to do. I think the other problem that we're also seeing is that a lot of jurisdictions right now are about the 20-year mark from having bought new voting equipment. When the 2000 election took place, between 2000 and 2006, many different jurisdictions in the United States bought new voting equipment. And so a lot of those pieces of voting equipment are aging out. In North Carolina, the state legislature said, we can't have any more of those direct recording electronic machines because there's not a paper trail that someone can take and look and make sure it was right. The only paper trail was within the machines. And so now everybody's voting on, the half of the state of North Carolina that was voting on DREs, the ATM style machines, are now voting on optical scan machines that were just rolled out with the primary earlier this year. So I want to just suggest from my research, I worry about costs. But finally, I think that we also need to be talking about not only South Korea and what they did, but also think about the other states, since we're looking at, and prominent political scientists and legal scholars are suggesting that we do more vote by mail. That's a tough ask. And if states really want to do that, they need to get moving on it. They really needed to get moving on it in March. But this partisanship is making it very difficult for us to be able to have a safe election, because the reality of what's going on out there may be one thing, right? We all know there are facts around that, but we also know that people view things from this partisan perspective. The mass public out there doesn't know really what to think about the coronavirus. Right now, they're listening to the elite pews, which may or may not be a good idea. So with that, I'll leave it and send it back to the panel.
Terrific. Thank you, Dr. Kropp. So, I mean, as you can see, there are still a lot of uncertainties and there's a lot of moving parts, right, between equipment to volunteers to different issues with respect to variations in procedures state by state. Dr. Kropp mentions an issue that has been showing up in the news for a lot of people and that I'm sure a number of our viewers are confused about, which is there's this controversy about, you know, should we be moving toward vote by mail for the upcoming election, or you know, sticking with in-person voting with expanded options for early voting or expanded voting days or things like that. And of course, as Dr. Charles points out, we need volunteers to be able to cover the expansions. And we need, as Dr. Kropp mentioned, an expanded time in which we would be able to do vote by mail. But to really unpack that, to help people understand the context, it has become a very partisan debate, right? This question of vote by mail or not. I wonder, Dr. Charles, if you've looked into this issue, if you could speak to why is this issue, like so many issues in election law and governance, why is this such a partisan issue about whether or not we ought to be voting by mail?
Sure. So first, the ideology and then the partisanship. And one of the things that I think students of American democracy need to recognize, and that they're beginning to recognize, is as a country, we really do have two different ways of thinking about political participation. So fundamentally, from the time of the founding of this country, we thought very narrowly about who was entitled to vote and what burdens they ought to bear in order to vote. And the conception was only a small number of people, proper deed, male, et cetera, were entitled to vote, and that it was sort of their responsibility, was not the government's responsibility. As modernity wore on, we also had a competing conception that everybody, or as broadly as possible, the conception of the polity ought to be entitled to vote, and to some extent, the government ought to bear a greater responsibility and not just the public. So first, we have two competing ideologies. Now, in the last 20 years or so, and Dr. Croft can say a lot more about this because she's done some of the best work on thinking through these questions. But in the last 20 years or so, ideology and partisanship have merged on these types of questions. So it used to be the case that we just had these ideologies, and it didn't make any difference where you were on the partisan scale. But in the last 20, 30 years or so, we see ideology and partisanship align. So if you're a Republican, you are more likely to think that people bear some responsibility for voting. It's not the government's responsibility, and it ought to be, and you ought to earn it. You should make it as easy as possible. And you're also worried about a different set of trade-offs, like voter fraud. If you're a Democrat, you're generally thinking that, no, it's the government responsibility to make it as easy for people to vote as possible. So you should do things like vote by mail, early voting, and you're worried about access, and you're less worried about voter fraud, right? So we have the ideology combined with partisanship, and we do have these two fundamental views. They're not uniformly expressed everywhere. So some states might have a stronger view than others, but that explains a lot of the battles that we are seeing around voting. And of course, now you layer all of that. This is why I think it was important to provide the legal framework. You lay all of that on a pandemic. You saw this play out in Wisconsin. What is it that we're going to do? Some people believe, the Republicans in the state legislature believe, we're just going to carry on as usual. And the counter move, generally by Democrats, were, no, we need to do something, postpone the election, expand hours, et cetera. But that's the battle that you're seeing play out, both ideology and partisanship, any context of a pandemic.
let me ask you to add one more thing to layer on top of that, which is you've written extensively about the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court struck down parts of the Voting Rights Act, and that has implications for the procedural rules that different states can and are enacting right now, and how that also can have impacts on disenfranchisement of some voters. I wonder if you could talk about, we have a question from our audience who's watching today about how we ought to think about that. What are the implications of that opinion and the fact that the Voting Rights Act, parts of it were struck down, on the kinds of procedures that can be put in place now, and on how we think about this issue of the right to, as you've showed us, we don't have a right to vote in a national election, let alone a right to vote by mail, but the kind of right to access through things like voting by mail.
Sure. 3 very quick points. One is the fact that the portions that the court struck down with respect to the Voting Rights Act applied only to certain types of jurisdictions, which then freed up, most of them were southern jurisdictions, which then freed them up to enact whatever preferences they wanted to. So some of these issues that we saw, that we would have seen, might have been slowed down. There's a question as to whether that's true or not, because you could have pre-cleared some of those changes, but it would be the current Justice Department with Donald Trump as president and Barr as the Attorney General. And so the question will be, how much would they have done? But nevertheless, you would have had to pre-clear some of those changes with either a court or in Washington, D.C., or the Justice Department. So that takes away one limitation. The second worry that we have, particularly in the context of—
Wait, before you move to the second worry, it seems like at a moment like now, where some changes might be valuable, and we're going to hear from Dr. Jenna and Dr. Croft as to whether or not they think some of those changes would make sense in the current context. But it seems like not having to pre-clear maybe would lead to greater efficiency, right? You could decide to expand your voting hours.
Not necessarily. That's true, and that's actually one of the arguments that that the jurisdictions and states that were subject to pre-clearance made, which is, look, you're making it harder for us to implement good changes that we want to implement, right? But you could just think of pre-clearance as saying, yeah, sure, that's fine. It puts a little bit of a friction on change, so it might make it a little bit less efficient, but it imposes a floor, right? So if you're going to do something bad, we're going to stop that from happening. If you're going to do something good, that's perfectly fine. We will pre-clear it. It will just delay it a little bit. So it is true that it imposes some friction and might make it inefficient, but it certainly wouldn't allow positive changes to go into play. So if, say, a jurisdiction that was covered by the VRA here in North Carolina, 28 counties, if they wanted to expand voting hours, that would have been pre-cleared, would have taken a little bit longer, but usually that happens fairly quickly when there are good changes. And so slows it down, but wouldn't stop it from going into effect.
And so even if at the last minute some changes are necessary in light of the changing situation of the pandemic, pre-clearance wouldn't have precluded those changes from going into effect.
Right. So pre-clearance, I think, would prevent negative things from happening, but wouldn't be a significant barrier in any way, because those are the Justice Department can communicate, no, we won't have any objections. We won't interpose any objections. You can go ahead and clear and implement those changes, and that would have been perfectly fine.
Okay, I interrupted you. You were about to make a second point. Do you wish to make that one now?
The only point I'll put on the table, and I think it was implied in your question, is the fact that the Voting Rights Act was particularly concerned about race and racial discrimination. Of course, one of the worries that we have with respect to the pandemic, when we think about vulnerable populations, we see the impact that the coronavirus has on particular vulnerable populations, and that includes voters of color. So I also wanted to get that on the table, as it was implied by your question.
Very good, thank you. I'm going to come to Dr. Croft in just a moment, because Dr. Charles has noted that you are have extraordinary scholarship on this very point, but I want to bring in Dr. Jenna just on this last point that Dr. Charles raises. So we've seen in the pandemic that there is a disproportionate effect right now on people of color, particularly African Americans and Hispanic populations seem to have much greater burden of disease, as well as mortality under the current pandemic. And that seems to be attributable largely to issues of systemic racism, as well as socioeconomic implications, access to healthcare. But how, looking at the data that you've looked at on, incidents of flu and the spreading of different respiratory and other illnesses in elections, were any of those broken down by race and demographics? And do we see that kind of impact, disproportionate spreading after voting? Any kind of insights that you can build on?
Yeah, good question. So not in what we did. We didn't break it down by race. I mean, I would say that the two things to be thinking about are, one is, are there race or socioeconomic differences in the likelihood of getting infection?
Mm-hmm.
The answer to that is yes.
Mm-hmm.
And we see the likelihood of infection is higher among Blacks, Hispanics, and lower socioeconomic populations. And the second is, conditional on getting an infection, is your outcome worse if you fall into any of those groups? And the answer there is also yes. Part of that is due to higher rates of other clinical comorbidities, things like that. Part of it's also going to be due to where individuals seek care, and geographic differences in care matter. Mm-hmm. We know, for example, that if you happen to be hospitalized with COVID-19 in a small hospital, your outcomes are going to be worse. Your mortality rate is higher than if you're admitted in a larger hospital. So where you live matters. Let me maybe ask a question for Dr. Charles. This is kind of a legal question, but I presume the law has something to say about uniformity in the costs of voting, so that it cannot be so different for one group to vote than another group in terms of the cost. And I'm sure people have thought about that. But how would you add this wrinkle in here that if the risk of disease, the risk of death is higher for certain groups if they leave their house to vote? That is probably a much higher cost than racial differences in terms of how many people are waiting in line to vote. Is there a legal way of thinking about this issue?
I wish there were, and the answer is probably not. So just think about it from this perspective. There are certain categories that the government can't make, upon which government can't condition access. Right, so the government can't say, okay, we're going to charge you money to vote, or the government can't say we're going to make it harder for you to vote because you're a person of color or because you're white, right? But there are also, outside of those categories, there are certain costs to voting that are not within the positive legal framework. So it might be the case that the lines at my polling place are shorter or longer compared to somebody else, unless I can show that that is being done intentionally, or in the context of the Voting Rights Act, that there's a disparate impact because of one of the protected categories, right? That falls either intentional or a disparate impact on one of the protected categories. In the Voting Rights Act, it's race, but broadly in the Constitution, intentionally, it could be gender, right? So unless it falls into one of those categories, really, the legal framework doesn't have much to say about it. Now, we could pass laws that make it easier for people to vote, that take these things into account. But the fact that, say, because of my socioeconomic status, it's a lot harder, or because of my health, I might bear certain costs that other people may not bear. Those are not legally actionable from a constitutional perspective. Again, if we have evidence that the government says, oh, we're going to make it harder for Black people to vote, or for white people to vote, or et cetera, that's a different story. But if it's simply because of my socioeconomic location, or that I may have certain comorbidities because of that associated with race, but these are impact as opposed to intent, then the legal framework is not really responsive to those sets of concerns and considerations.
Dr. Croft, I know you have done a good bit of research on these questions, the ability of disadvantaged classes to really participate in elections. I note that you wrote an article in the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation that people with disabilities vote less often than people without due to factors such as the desire to avoid crowds, memory challenges, their inability to drive, difficulty moving around or communicating. So can you speak a little bit about what concerns you may have for the upcoming election for both people with disabilities, but also for people with, as we've been talking about, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, they may be more disadvantaged, may be more likely to both contract and bear a higher burden of disease if they contract COVID-19.
So what I think might be the interesting point for this is that this might actually be an advantage for people with certain types of disabilities for whom it is more difficult to get to the polling places. My idea, not this particular one, because there's so rarely a pandemic, it's difficult to study, but my thinking on this is because a lot of people with disabilities are going to be on permanent absentee lists in states where that's possible, where they're automatically mailed an absentee ballot, or have in the past many times voted absentee, and it's something they're used to. Yes, they participate less generally. Yes, there are issues of them not getting to participate fully because of the barriers that are there to their participation. But in this instance, it might actually be something of an advantage. So for that idea, I am rather optimistic. I'm currently now working on, the problem is though that the people that are most likely to vote or most likely to participate in politics who have disabilities or happen to have disabilities, or particularly that vote at a polling place on election day, are the ones that are most out there in the community. So for those individuals who are already out there in the community and very involved, their mobility is high, their ability to work is high. I think it's going to pose a difficulty for those individuals, but for others who are already on permanent absentee lists, it's something of a good thing.
All right, I want to do a quick rapid round to put a couple more facts on the table, which is kind of looking forward at the election. What are if you were to name the kind of top two issues that you are most concerned about the intersection of the pandemic and voting and elections in the fall, what are you most worried about? And I'm asking us to do this rapidly because we're getting questions about this from our audience about, if you were to say, this is what I have the greatest concern about, and then I want us to turn the conversation to the upside, which is, what do you advocate to make this all safer? How are we going to enable us to both vote safely while safeguarding our right to vote? And so I'm going to do this in reverse, which is start with Dr. Kropf and say, if you were to name, kind of, this is what I'm most concerned about for the upcoming election in light of the pandemic.
I'm worried about polling agencies, or I should say local election jurisdictions, having enough funding to be able to buy adequate hand sanitizer, gloves, large enough polling places to be able to do what South Korea did, which was if you have a fever, you go over to that side of the polling place.
You just describe that for people who haven't been following what happened in South Korea, just kind of briefly describe what they did.
In April, when South Korea had their elections, so they have a central agency controlling their elections as opposed to the United States with 50 states, 50 different elections. They had had lots of hand sanitizer in every polling place. They gave out gloves so that people could use the gloves to vote. They marked out the physical distances for people waiting in line. Boy, if the lines were unwieldy though, I don't know how long they're not gonna be able to mark all the way around the block, right? But they also, they had an app. So for people who are on a self-quarantine, they have this app. They reported when they were gonna go to the polling place. And those folks that were under self-quarantine were actually allowed to go vote after hours outside after everybody else had voted. And they marked in their app when they went and when they got there and when they left. So they were tracked, which of course we Americans just don't appreciate at all. But they were very careful. They also allowed early voting. They also allowed by mail voting. And so
they implemented a lot of measures and the results were positive, meaning.
So they say.
So they say. From what we know, the results are positive. All right, Dr.
Yes.
Charles, what are you most worried about for the upcoming election in light of the pandemic?
A surge in November that has an impact on one or two battleground states that reduces political participation, and then that calls into question the legitimacy of the election.
Oof, that's a terrifying one.
Yes.
Especially since
exactly what I was worried about.
That's a heavy and weighty one, especially since we have so many worries about whether or not the legitimacy of the election may be questioned under any circumstances, but especially when battleground states like that's a wow. All right, Dr. Jenna.
I have to say spread of disease. I'm worried about spread of disease.
I was hoping you were going to say that, so I didn't have to say it. I'm like, there's a doctor on the panel that he ought to be worried about.
What you comment on the legitimacy of the election, I was thinking, and this goes to Dr. Croft's point, is that I'm sure there's going to be differences in the propensity of individuals to take the chance to go out there and vote based on their political affiliation. And so this is going to be like a Nate Silver bonanza to try to predict what the outcome is going to be because of this intricacy that we've never had to think about before.
Right. For example, for mail ballots, if there's a partisan skew, as Dr. Croft tells us, and those are going to be late in counting, right. So you can imagine that, well, we might have some idea with respect to the in-person, and that's going to skew one way from a partisan perspective. And then once you factor in the mail ballots, 2-3 days later, that changes the outcome. People might raise significant legitimacy questions, but it simply is a function of the partisan skew.
All right, so
then we'll have litigation that you worry about, right? I mean, we need these to be sort of what one of your colleagues calls beyond the margin of litigation, right? I mean, I don't know if that's possible or how many of the ballots would get challenged or for what reasons, but I share your worry.
I think we're unlikely to be beyond the margin of litigation for anything for the upcoming election. But that being said, okay, so we have limitations on resources, which is likely to lead to further spread of the disease, leading to some voters not showing up and more voters showing up in particular potential ideologies, leading to questions of legitimacy of the election. This sounds dire and concerning. And so you're the experts. Tell us, what can we do to both safeguard individuals, but also safeguard the election? Because I think we all hope for the ability for people to be fully able to vote, but to do so without fear of contracting COVID-19 while doing so. And so who wants to take that one first? How are we going to solve this problem? Dr. Charles, I see your mute went off, and so I'll take that to be
Sure.
hopeful prognostication about what we can do.
I'll be very quick. So we just had a recent election primary in Kentucky that, for all accounts, went pretty well, and for maybe 2 or 3 reasons. One of which is that the partisans worked well together, so there was bipartisan agreement. They did early voting. They did vote by mail. They had a very aggressive vote by mail campaign, and so I'll just limit it to those 3 things. Partisans must work well together, try to do as much early voting as possible, vote by mail, starting that process as early as one can, and building a campaign around it so that way the lines are as short as possible. Yeah, there were some issues in Kentucky, but overall, I think the outcome, the result in terms of what people thought the process went, they thought that it was very well. So I think that's a good example that shows that this can be done, and it can be done in November.
A quick follow-up question to that. So since you've been telling us about the differences procedurally and legally by jurisdiction on these different votes, the vote by mail issue would require procedural changes in a number of jurisdictions, right? Because some jurisdictions you have to qualify based on an illness or a disability or likelihood of being away from the county at the time of the election. And so is there enough time to make those changes? How long do those changes take? And are we likely to see some of those changes in time for the election?
There are a couple of things that one can do that are fairly simple. So if your state doesn't provide for no excuse absentee balloting, well, those laws can be changed. That way you can request an absentee ballot, and you don't need to have an excuse that is, I'm going to be out of town, I'm sick, etc. So I think that should be a low-hanging fruit of something that can be done. Other things are a lot harder. So actively sending ballots, massive ballots to voters, right? So there's some things that do require more time, but certainly allowing voters to request an absentee ballot, maybe providing for more polling places. There are some things that can be done even within the time frame that we currently have.
Great. Dr. Pratt.
Well, I agree with you. Those are things that can be done, but one thing that's going to be tough is...
No. First, you're telling me things that can be done. Good things. I want the positive. What's the hopeful way that we can...
Well, so I'll tell you, hopefully, if we're having face-to-face classes, I'm going to have my service learning class that was going to be doing exit polling on election day, and I am not subjecting them to that this year. I'm going to have them volunteer with our local election board to work with the by-mail votes. I have a feeling that's going to be a significant logistical issue for them. So there's positive, hopefully.
So a possibility is people can volunteer to...
Yes, so I don't know, I would suggest that anyone who can volunteer to be a poll worker, because I think that's where we're seeing the most significant issues. So if you don't think coronavirus is an issue, by all means, go be a poll. Seriously, go be a poll worker. Because I think that's where when we saw problems in Wisconsin, when we saw problems in Georgia, or at least around the Atlanta area, we certainly did see problems because people didn't know what to think about the coronavirus or were scared.
Now you can tell me what some of the hurdles are, because I know that some of the suggestions are challenging ones. You've spoken about the concern about whether or not there are going to be adequate resources available, not just for things like hand sanitizer, but of course, are we going to have enough, printing of, the number of requests for mail-in ballots that will actually occur? Do we have enough? In the same way that we had critical shortages of PPE, are we going to have critical shortages of the ability to print legitimate ballots? Are these types of concerns if there's a surge in the request?
Well, I think it's a matter of, some of these locals, they're great, but it's best to practice things a little bit before you actually implement them. At least it has been for local. So if you buy new equipment, you want to run it on a small election first, or a couple of small elections to get you used to it. And I think that with a surge in absentee balloting, and we certainly saw a surge in Georgia, that they're not going to get a lot of practice. That being said, they are all expecting it, so they will prepare, but hopefully there'll be enough in the way of physical infrastructure. So yeah, I think those are good. Those are that could be a problem. That could be an issue, but there are reasons to hope. Oregon took years to figure out how to do by-mail balloting. They did it okay from the beginning. They had great survey results right after, indicating people weren't socially pressured to vote a certain way in their living room. So I think we have reasons to be optimistic about by-mail voting.
I certainly hope we don't have a rainy day on election day or a rainy season, because I know that one of the concerns that people have is that a lot of the locations for polling aren't suitable during COVID, that they are too small, they're poorly ventilated, they have other problems to be able to implement some of the measures that I think Dr. Jenna is going to tell us about. So Dr. Jenna, you have some ways that we can safeguard ourselves to vote, I hope, so that we can vote as safely as possible, whether by mail, which seems like it would be the safest if I can get my ballot and do it with my own pencil in the confines of my own home. And I have a stamp already, so I don't have to go anywhere to get one. I'm going to be in good shape. But otherwise, if I've got to go into a polling location, what are some of the things that we ought to be doing in both the polling locations, but just to set up these elections to safeguard people as well as possible?
Yeah, so I'll say two things. One related to that, which is mail voting, obviously the best solution. The second thing is anything that minimizes the degree of person-to-person interaction. So that could involve trying to spread the election. And this is now obviously not informed by any political knowledge or legal knowledge, but spreading the election over multiple days, extending the length of the voting, increasing the number of voting sites so that the number of people going to a particular site is less than it would have been historically. Also thinking about the bunching of voting. So if a lot of people tend to vote in the morning and others tend to vote in the afternoon, but it's relatively open in the middle of the day, working with large employers and employers on that day to allow individuals to go vote throughout the day, and potentially even requiring individuals to try and vote, with some exceptions perhaps, in pre-scheduled blocks. So if your last name begins with a J, then you go between these hours here. And the idea, again, is just to minimize the number of people that are interacting with each other all at one time. The last thing I'd say is that here's an area where I think evidence could actually be very useful. So we now have, and we will certainly have by November, a number of situations where large gatherings have occurred, whether it be primary elections, whether it be protests related to recent issues, whether it be presidential rallies, whatever it is. There's going to be a lot of these natural experiments that are happening all around us. And there's no reason why we couldn't figure out whether or not the disease is going to spread in this way and how much is it going to spread. And then that at least gives policymakers a number, because there's a trade-off here, obviously. I mean, presumably there's a trade-off between mail voting versus in-person voting. Mm-hmm. And we want to know what is the price that we have to pay for that. And if we can use good evidence to say that the price is very high, that should, I think, even convince the staunchest of opposers of mail voting.
Dr. Charles, just quickly on the opposition to mail-in voting. You mentioned the partisan and the ideology have met itself, but if you could just, sort of succinctly explain to those engaged here, why oppose mail-in voting? What are the legitimate and partisan and potentially less legitimate concerns that people have about mail-in voting?
Sure. I mean, the most legitimate concern you could have about mail-in voting is the worry that somebody's going to come to your house and they're going to tell you how to vote. They'll buy the vote, they'll coerce you, then they'll be able to go to the neighbor's house, they'll be able to gather a bunch of ballots or coerce a lot of people and swing, particularly a small election. And we've seen recently an allegation along those lines. So that's, whereas, for example, in person, I tell my students, like, they're way too smart to ever think about committing in-person voter fraud, right? What is the point of going and saying that you're somebody else? And then if you try to get 20 or 30 people to go along with you, well, that will founder fairly quickly, right? Okay. So that's a legitimate worry about mail voting, is it is an easier vehicle to commit voter fraud than probably any other mechanism that we currently have in the modern framework.
And what's the partisan concern that is driving a move against mail-in voting?
The partisan concern is that Republicans, on average, are much more worried about voter fraud than they are about voter access, whereas Democrats, on average, are much more worried about voter access than they are voter fraud. So when it comes to determining certain types of procedures, Democrats are trying to provide the broadest access as possible. Republicans, on average, are thinking about security and voter fraud. And so that's the partisan valence, then that allows this type of an issue to fall into the partisan football.
Very helpful. Thank you. We have just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to invite each of you to just give us a brief 30 seconds on how we can best safeguard ourselves, our right to vote in the upcoming elections, and how you plan to do so. So starting with Dr. Jenna.
So I plan to mail in vote. I'll just say one thing is that, what we can expect to happen in November with voting will depend on what has happened until that point. And so if prevalence is low, that's a different situation than if prevalence is high in an area. That may explain partly the South Korean example. Some of it may be due to actual steps that they took during voting. Some of it may also be due to the fact that they are on a part of the curve far to the left. If they were far to the right of the curve, a little tick would have set things off. And so that's what I would be thinking about. I mean, this is a heterogeneous landscape. There's going to be some areas where voting in person is probably going to be very dangerous, and in other areas where it's going to be it might be okay. But thank you. I think you're muted.
Oh, I'm muted. No wonder. So I was saying Dr. Croft, I was going to invite to give her quick 30 seconds, and then we'll finish it off with Dr. Charles.
So my plan for voting is I'm trying to talk myself into being a poll worker. I am a worrywart, and but yeah, I'll be watching. Dr. Jenna, that's good advice. Watch what's been going on. Where are we with the curve? But I feel strongly enough about this. I've been struggling with it, but I think that we need to do by mail voting now, and then look at how it goes, and then talk about what we're going to do with by mail voting in the future.
Terrific. Thank you. Dr. Charles.
I need to request an absentee ballot. I think that is the prudent thing at this time. But but Dr. Jenna's advice, I think, is very useful. You have to look and see where the rates of incidence are, which is not something that I was thinking about. So that's very useful advice.
Well, I plan to be out of Durham County, and so I will be making a request for my absentee ballot as soon as I am able to do so. But I want to thank our panelists today for the enlightening and rich conversation about how we can vote safely and safeguard our right to vote in the upcoming elections in light of the pandemic. I also want to invite you to go to scipaul.org and to our website, scienceandsociety.duke.edu, to read the policy brief that was authored by Dr. Maria Carnevale on this issue, on election and how we can safely hold elections going forward. And invite you to engage with the scholarship of each of our panelists today who've written extensively on the issue to help guide us and guide elections forward, both outside of crazy times like this and both inside of the difficult global pandemic we currently find ourselves in. Thank you for joining us today, and please join us next time for our next coronavirus conversation. Thank you. Take care.